Hi, everybody. In chapter 13, you are going to be reading about homicide, victims and their families, and the community at large in terms of victimization. When we talk about homicide, homicide can be defined as any intentional or sometimes unintentional or accidental killing of another person. Murder is the unlawful taking of human life. When you look at the definitions, it can further be classified into first degree and second degree. And every state's a little bit different, but first degree murder or intentional homicide has planning attached to it. So it's a premeditated event. When we talk about second degree or manslaughter, that would be still taking the life of another person, but there's no premeditation attached to that. Why that's significant is, number one, for the time that a person is going to get in prison. So you'll get fewer years for second degree or manslaughter than you would for first degree. And then also, we do have 31 states who have the death penalty. And in order to qualify for the death penalty, it has to be first degree or premeditated murder. So that's why those are important. But again, every state is a little bit different. When we look at the scope of the problem, the uniform crime rate, which we've talked about previously, is the earliest classification system that we used here in the United States to track homicides. And we have seen a steady decrease since the 1990s. Let me pull up this page here. This is the Uniform Crime Report violent crime rate. It does include murder and non-negligent manslaughter rates. So if you look, starting in 1960, you can see, and by the way, this is 5.1 per 100,000 of the population. So if we look at the rates, we'll see 5 started jumping up to 7 in the late 60s. We had an increase all the way through the 1970s, kind of reached a peak here in 1980, high rates of 8 and 9, all the way through until about the mid 1990s. And then we started to see a decrease, and we've seen that trend since the 1990s. So that's still high, but homicides are actually a very small percentage of violent crime here in the United States. But if you look at the number of people, it's still startling. In 2014, over 13,000 people were murdered here in the United States, 15,000 in 2015. That was a 11% increase across those 2 years. But it is a small portion of all of the violent crime here in the United States. And the good news, if there is any, is that it has been declining since the 1980s. When you look at the homicide rates here in the United States as compared to other countries, by the way, we have startlingly high rates. This is just comparing it to Canada. But if you look at the murder rate in most Western cultures, like Great Britain, Australia, France, we have higher homicide rates here in the United States. And when we look at the weapons that are used in homicide, you can see that the vast majority of homicides here in the United States are with handguns. And this is probably the difference in our homicide rates when we compare our homicide rates to other countries like Canada or Great Britain, because we have more guns here in the United States than they do in those cultures. The legal response to murder, all legal codes classify murder as a major crime. It is classified as part of the violent crime rate in the Uniform Crime Rate. And again, every state is a little bit different in terms of the first degree, the second degree, the premeditation. Penalties for homicide, you are going to serve a longer prison term these days than you did in the 1980s or 1970s. On average, your textbook says about 22 years. But again, we have a first degree homicide, which in a state that is a death penalty state, that would qualify for the death penalty. With first degree in states that don't have the death penalty, it is usually life in prison. And again, every case is going to be a little bit different. It depends on the circumstances, whether or not somebody has a record. So there are a lot of circumstances that are going to play a role in how long the prison term is going to be. And every state, in terms of their rules and regulation that are attached to particular crimes. When we look at recidivism rates for murder, it's a category where we have very high recidivism rates. You can see here it says 67% are rearrested if they are let out of prison, and 50% are reincarcerated. So we do have high recidivism rates. That's because the vast majority of offenders that engage in homicide usually engage in other types of crimes as well. It's kind of that lifelong offenders. So these are people that probably were getting into trouble early, probably had a juvenile arrest record. It's the vast majority of people that commit a homicide don't do it out of the blue with no other criminal record. Now, not that it can't happen, it does, but that's why you see higher recidivism rates. When we look at the different types of homicide, single homicide just means a single event. So one person is killed at one time. A double homicide is two victims who are killed at one time in one location. Triple would be three people killed. Mass murder is any homicide of four or more victims in a single location. There are different classifications for mass murder. There's something called the classic mass murder. This is when one person kills a number of people. That could be a school shooting. That could be a terrorist act. And then we have family mass murders. That's when one family member kills at least four members of their family. With both types of mass murder, we often find suicide attached to the offender. That's particularly true with family mass murders. Now, a spree murder is a killing of that's a killing with two or more locations with no cooling off period. So it can be killing one person at one location and then driving to another location and killing more people there. That would be an example of a spree murder. We had one in Chattanooga a few years ago where an offender went to one location that was a military recruiting location and killed some people there, and then drove to a second military recruiting location and killed more people there. We had the Sandy Hook shooting a few years ago where the offender killed his mom at his home, and then he drove to the elementary school and killed people there. That would be an example of a spree murder because you have two locations. A serial murder is when at least two or more people are killed. And what makes serial murder different from all of the others is that there is a cooling off period between the offenses. With the vast majority of serial murders that you guys are probably familiar with, they might kill one person and then not kill again for months. Sometimes it's days, weeks, months, even years sometimes. So you look at somebody like Ted Bundy, for example, who would kill one person and then not do it for months, and then kill multiple people within days and then not do it for months. Somebody like the Zodiac killer, who there were months between those offenses. Those are examples of serial murderers. We also have homicide, suicide. That's when one person kills another person and then kills themselves. Usually there's some type of relationship there, a family type of relationship. Now, when it comes to victimization theories, and we've kind of looked at some of these already. So when we look at lifestyle routine activities theories, this is just looking at the lifestyle or the routine of the victim that increases their risk. So maybe think of somebody that buys a lot of drugs, for example. So they go to a particular part of town that's a little bit dangerous. They're engaging with people that are criminals, and that increases their risk of victimization. Now, we're not blaming the victim when we look at these types of theories. We're simply looking at them as an explanation for why they were at an increased risk. Cultural theories look at how culture influences people. Social learning theory, again, that's based on the work of Albert Bandura that suggests people model behaviors. So this is suggesting that in some subcultures here in the United States, some neighborhoods, homicide is modeled maybe with gangs, or that it's kind of a norm in a particular neighborhood. And then there are theories that suggest by watching violent media that that increases aggression, particularly in young people, and then that might contribute to engaging in homicide. We'd never want to say that, sometimes after particularly school shootings, there's a lot of talk in the media about how the offenders might have played violent video games, or maybe they watched violent content on television, like the Batman shooting, the Batman theater shooting, suggesting that the offender watching the movies, caused him to engage in violent behavior. Be very careful when you hear those kinds of things. The vast majority of people that engage in things like that, in mass murders, have other issues going on. If we look at their background, we can see lots of red flags that we didn't catch. We can't say that playing a video game caused a person to go out and commit homicide. Could it be one factor among many that may have contributed to their behavior? Absolutely. But and some people are more susceptible than others to media. But think of yourself, if you play violent video games or watch television shows with violent content or movies, do you feel the need to go out and commit a crime afterwards? And the answer is no. So again, the vast majority of mentally healthy people are not going to engage in any type of crime after being exposed to violent media. Now, when it comes to the demographics of the offender, this is a young male category of crime. The vast majority of offenders, if you look at the demographics, African Americans represent about 48% of homicide offenders, and that is a disproportionate percentage when you look at the U.S. population. So African Americans represent 48% of homicide offenders, but only 13% of the U.S. population. The vast majority of offenders, by the way, are white. The vast majority of victims, actually being a young African American male, is the highest risk category for becoming the victim of homicide. Now, when we hear these types of statistics, don't jump to the wrong conclusion here. This has nothing to do with race or ethnicity or anything like that. What it has to do with is the fact that we have unequal access to all kinds of things here in the United States. There are minorities in this country that do not have equal access to education, to jobs, to security, to good neighborhoods, to good schools. It's the social disparities that really account for these variations that we see. It really has nothing to do with race or ethnicity or religion or any of those kinds of things. But again, it is primarily a male crime. Females are arrested for homicide. It's statistically much lower for females than for males. And again, the vast majority of offenders are white males, and it's a young category of crime as well. Now, when it comes to homicide typologies, there are a lot of different typologies out there. The FBI has a lot of interesting typologies that have been created with the behavioral science unit. They have an organized and disorganized crime scene. Organized offenders plan the crime out. They tend to have good verbal skills, a high degree of intelligence, and how you can tell is by looking at the crime scene. They don't leave a lot of evidence behind. It seems to be planned. They bring their own weapons. A disorganized offender, it's usually not planned out. They leave a lot of evidence at the scene. They usually use items at the scene as weapons. They tend to kind of just have a poor self-image. They're underachievers. With organized offenders, by the way, we would probably see somebody that has antisocial personality disorder and who has a psychopathic behavioral pattern attached to that. But this typology was created by the FBI. If you look on page 504 of your textbook on table 13.2, it has some of the specific characteristics of an organized and disorganized crime scene. Underclass homicide typology, hundreds of thousands of homicide offenders who do not make the headlines. We do have some things that are sensationalized, some crimes that are sensationalized that really are, they take on, they're taken on by the media, like Casey Anthony case, for example, down in Florida, O.J. Simpson case. But of course, there are thousands of cases that never make the news. And when we think about coming up with new homicide typologies, we look at the characteristics of the motivation for the crime. So the homicide precipitated by an argument, the homicide during the commission of a felony. And by the way, this is the largest category right here. So let's say somebody is robbing a liquor store or a convenience store and kills somebody while robbing that liquor store. That would be a homicide during the commission of a felony. Or they are sexually assaulting somebody and they commit murder against that person. That would be homicide during the commission of a felony. And again, this is the category where we find most homicides actually take place. Domestic violence related homicide, that means that there is some type of family relationship or dating relationship or previous relationship between the victim and the offender. And a homicide charge following an accident. So this would be maybe a car accident. If you are drinking while driving, for example, these would be, that would fall under this particular category here. Or if you are shooting a gun up in the air and the bullet happens to hit somebody, that would also be homicide charged following an accident. Now, when it comes to, because we're looking at, issues with victims, and of course, the victims of homicide are going to be leaving behind family and friends who are called co-victims. So co-victim is, anybody that is going to be affected by and potentially traumatized by the homicide. Some of the issues that we look at in terms of dealing with co-victims: death notifications, and this is usually done by police officers, and more police officers are being trained by psychologists on how to deliver a death notification in the most compassionate way possible. Other issues that co-victims are going to have to deal with, of course, are funeral activities, police investigations, potentially going into trial, witnessing trials, the dealing with the medical examiner's office, and in some cases dealing with the media. Lives can really be destroyed by homicide. Co-victims, family members in particular, are going to be dealing with grief. They could be feeling guilt. They could be feeling some type of blame. They could have issues with having to return to school or work. That's really difficult to focus when you are grieving. Focus on school or work. They might develop fears and phobias. I mean, this is particularly true if it was a violent crime. Or if the crime took place, somebody broke into somebody's house and murdered. That really instills fear in not only co-victims, but the community at large. And they could develop mental health issues, depression, anxiety, drinking, in order to deal with all of the feelings that they're feeling. So we don't want to minimize the fact that co-victims are going to often need help, grief counseling. If the case is going to be going to trial, they might need a victim's advocate to, first of all, help them understand the trial process and to really kind of explain what's going on as they move through it, helping them to create those victim impact statements that we talked about previously. So go ahead and read the chapter. Lots of really interesting information in the chapter, and then let me know if you have any questions.